And then, of course, there's this very peculiar moral calculus. In the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's the only conflict in history where we get a running tally of the casualty figures as if that somehow tells you about who's got the moral high ground. It doesn't happen in any other conflict. But throughout Gaza, we got number of Palestinians killed, number of Israelis killed, and of course, there was a big discrepancy. So one wonders what was the point of providing us with such a detailed account of the casualties. And they don't, of course, casualties don't tell the whole story. If they did, we would have erected a statue to Adolf Hitler in Whitehall, and we would have branded Winston Churchill one of the world's worst ever war criminals, because German casualties were so much higher than British casualties. But does that equate to a moral calculus as to who was in the right and who was in the wrong? No, they don't tell the whole story. And not only that, when you consider the matter of rockets that I remember Jon Snow of Channel 4 News dismissed as nothing more than firecrackers. Well, these are the firecrackers. And ever since 2001 and 2002, when they first started being fired at Israel, if you remember, they were mortars, and then they were Katyushas, and then they were Grad missiles, and then there were Fajr missiles. They're all coming from Iran, by the way. And just look at the range now. On that map on the right-hand side there shows you that these Gaza missiles can reach almost every part of Israel now. And even the furthermost perimeter of that arc that you see, the people there have only 1.5 minutes to seek shelter. And they do. And it's as a result of the extraordinary investment Israel has put at huge cost into early warning systems, into tunnels, into civil defense exercises. It's only as a result of that that Israeli casualties have been low. It's not for any lack of trying by Hamas. Again, a complex slide. I don't want to go into any detail. Just look at the bottom line if you can see it. 18,000 total attacks since 2001. They started in 2001. The first fatalities happened in 2004. Significant date. Significant date, because what we are told is that the rockets were a response to the Israeli blockade, the siege, as Hamas call it, after Israel left in 2005. Well, hold on, they've got their timeline a bit confused. Okay, Israel, the first rocket attacks came in the early 2000s, first fatalities in 2004, and when Israel left completely in 2005 and continued to receive rocket attacks, that was when the blockade was started, the partial blockade. So the rockets couldn't have been a response to something that hadn't happened yet. And the other thing I want to draw your attention to, that if you look across, the horizontal text is about the period that the various military operations took place, like Cast-Lead, Protective Edge, and after each of those, the total number of attacks, as you see the red arrows pointing down, the total attacks dropped. And that shows you that actually these military incursions were highly effective in stopping the rocket attacks. We hear that Israel's got this Iron Dome, so why should she worry about the rockets? Well, it's 90% effective. That's pretty good, 90%, but it's only 90% effective. 10% gets through. I'll leave you to do the math, as they say in the United States. It doesn't mean there's 100% protection, and there never will be. And there's a quote from a resident of Sderot who makes the point that even if the rockets don't kill or injure people, it's that constant fear of attack. People are living on their nerves all of the time. That's what's so damaging about the threat of these rockets, not just when they're fired, but the fact that people who are within range, which is most Israelis, are aware that they could be subjected to another barrage at any time. And I'm going to move on pretty quickly. I recommend you to look at a website called COGAT, which is the coordinator of the humanitarian aid for Palestinian territories, because they have been letting through on a daily basis hundreds and hundreds of trucks filled with cement and with fuel and with other provisions to ensure that the people of Gaza don't suffer. And the people of Gaza are not suffering in the way that they're often portrayed. These are images from Gaza today. A new shopping mall, a new hotel. These are images we don't see in the mainstream media. I'm not minimizing the suffering of the people of Gaza, but we're not getting a balanced picture of what is going on. Okay, that's mini lecture 2 over. We're halfway through now. And so you see the connection between the first part and the second part, and you'll see, again, there'll be a connection in what I go on to say about the occupation and settlements. Any burning questions or comments in this 5 minutes? Yes? Yes, one human life to me is exactly the same as another human life. And that's the view I've always taken. But I think it does help sometimes to give people a sense of perspective. So, for example, over the last 7 to 8 weeks, since the beginning of October, when this stabbing intifada started in Israel, about 24 Israelis have died. Israelis and others, actually, not just Israelis. But 24 people think that's not very much, but it's in a country of 8 million. So if we multiply that up to be equivalent to, say, let's compare it to what France suffered in that dreadful attack. You know, it's way in excess of what France suffered, but the world is obsessed, and quite rightly so, with what happened in Paris a couple of weeks ago. But what is happening in Israel now is being totally ignored. So for some reason, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, one human life is certainly not worth another. And this is something that Israel has been suffering, as you know, for many, many decades. Any other comments? Yes?
Part of the reason I'm here is to improve my knowledge of the situation and give sympathy and support. My question is, I have a sneaky feeling it's Israel. Who feeds Gaza? Because they must need hundreds of tons of meat a day, 100 of potatoes or whatever.
It's largely Israel. They are self-sufficient up to a point in a number. They have some homegrown agriculture, but it's very limited. And unfortunately, the priorities of the Hamas government are such that they tend not to take a great deal of interest in that. But yes, most of the subsistence comes from Israel, transferred by Kogat through the various crossing points on a daily basis. And as a result of that, fortunately, there hasn't been the kind of large-scale hunger and distress that, although it doesn't stop people claiming that has happened, the fact is it hasn't. And in fact, the United Nations recently complimented Israel on its efforts to promote the rehabilitation of Gaza, although at the same time managed to put in a few digs at Israel at the same time. But that's okay, they're entitled to do that. At least they recognize the basic reality that Israel is letting goods through in the crossing points. But as you saw from the map there, Gaza has another border, and that's with Egypt. Egypt has closed that border entirely. Nothing goes into Gaza from Egypt, period. And yet, I don't hear outrage about that for some reason. Okay, yes, very quickly, yes. I have absolutely no idea, but I suspect you would have to be a fairly high-up official in the Hamas organization to get access to those. I suspect. I don't know. Really? I mean, I do know many years ago, before the first Intifada, Israelis used to go to the beach. I don't know if they took holidays there, but certainly Syrian Chalmers, who I mentioned earlier, he spent his honeymoon in Gaza. And Israelis used to visit and contribute to the the Gazan economy, but of course now they can't. But the fact is, some people are doing all right in Gaza. Okay, let's move on now to the third topic, question of legality. Again, I won't bore you with a historical lecture. Many of you will know this story in any case. We're coming up in a couple of years' time to the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. And you will hear that the Balfour Declaration created Israel. And what right did Britain have to give the Jews Israel in the Balfour Declaration? Actually, the Balfour Declaration, although it was important, is not the legal basis for the establishment of Israel. It was a recognition of the developing Jewish national home, but it was the San Remo Resolution of 1920 where the League of Nations created the mandate system. And the League of Nations mandated, literally, Britain to develop the Jewish national home. That's why the mandate was created. That was its whole raison d'etre. It wasn't just, somewhere down paragraph 23, clause 7. The reason the mandate was created was to promote the establishment of a Jewish national home. Anyway, we could spend the whole of the rest of the evening on this topic. But if we fast forward towards the end of the mandate, 1947, Britain ends the mandate, pulls out, and there's a civil war and then an international war. There was a ceasefire in 1949, and those ceasefire lines are what people call the pre-1967 borders. So very important to understand, there are no pre-1967 borders. They do not and never have existed. What we have are ceasefire lines that were temporary, and they were agreed at the Rhodes Conference in 1949 that they would be temporary until there was a final peace agreement. The UN Security Council recognized this after the 1967 war in its Resolution 242, which did not call for a total Israeli withdrawal from all of these territories, but called for a withdrawal to secure and recognize boundaries. There's that word, boundaries, being used in international law for the first time in relation to Israel. And then we have what people call the occupation of Palestinian territory until the establishment of the Palestinian Authority under the Oslo Accords, which were signed off, incidentally, by the UN, amongst other people. So it has the force of international law. And then in 2005, the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. But the key event was the Six-Day War in June 1967, where Israel occupied all these territories, the Sinai, the Golan, the West Bank and Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Now, I'm not an international lawyer. Maybe somebody here is. Anybody an international lawyer here? It would be nice if there were. It's a shame. But I've looked at this in a lot of detail, and it's quite hard to get a handle on what it is exactly that people are getting at when they talk about the illegality of the occupation. You hear about Israel's illegal occupation and the illegal settlements, and it turns out that the legal status of the occupation and the settlements are linked in people's minds. So they say this: the occupation is illegal, therefore the settlements are illegal. In fact, the legal arguments are extremely complicated, and they've been really hijacked by this lawfare which has been pursued by Palestinians and their supporters, which is to take Israel to every conceivable international legal authority, including the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, the UN and elsewhere, to try to get Israel condemned as an illegal occupier. What I have discovered is there is a technical term which is always applied to Israel and which actually de facto Israel has accepted, which is as a belligerent occupier of these territories. And I've tried to find definitions, and there are a couple of definitions, and the key thing about belligerent occupation is that it involves the invasion by one state of another state's sovereign territory. That's the key way that a belligerent occupation is defined. And if we look at the status of the territories that Israel occupied in 1967, well, Golan, Syria was the sovereign state. It's not at all clear to me whether Syria remains a sovereign state today of any of its territory. Egypt was sovereign in Sinai, and that was handed back. Gaza, Egypt never asserted sovereignty over Gaza. On the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the only country that asserted sovereignty was Jordan, and that was only recognized by Britain and Pakistan. So in terms of the sovereignty of these territories, apart from the ones that nobody's interested in, the remainder, namely the West Bank and Gaza, did not belong to any sovereign nation that Israel invaded. But on the contrary, Israel moved into those territories as a result of being attacked by them. And here's the point, here's a linkage of the point that Israel did not undertake a war of aggression against her neighbors, but took the territories as part of a defensive exercise. And then the settlements that ensued from that were actually had a legal basis in the Palestine Mandate of 1922. If that sounds a long time ago, it turns out the Palestine Mandate is still valid to this day, because when the League of Nations was dissolved and the UN was created in 1945, all the provisions of the League of Nations and its mandates were incorporated into the UN Charter. And that's never changed. So if you want to be legalistic about it, and that's what the critics are saying, they're saying it's not my opinion, it's illegal. Israel shouldn't be there, shouldn't be settling. Well, we can be legalistic too. The International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion, and the International Court of Justice, I should emphasize, is a branch of the UN. It's a political body. Its judges are elected by the UN, and they're not there for their legal expertise. Anyway, they were asked by the Palestinians, of course, to look at the legality of Israel's security barrier. And in 2004, they judged that the settlements were illegal. They weren't asked an opinion on that, but they judged they were illegal because the occupation was illegal. And that is often quoted. But that's one view. There are lots of other views, including the one I've just given you. But media outlets such as the BBC constantly reiterate that the settlements are illegal in international law. Not that the Palestinians claim they are illegal, they are illegal in international law. And I just think that is extremely shoddy reporting. And I mentioned to you that Israel accepted customary international law, while rejecting those legalistic arguments, accepted that the Fourth Geneva Convention applied in terms of the provision of humanitarian aid. The other thing I want to really emphasize to you, I'm not in favor of settlement across all of these territories by any means. What I do, because I'm old enough to remember, I know why these settlements were established. They were established by a labor government, a socialist government, not by right-wing religious fanatics, as the settlers are often portrayed today. There are such people, let's be frank about that. That is not why the settlements were established. They were established by a labor government, first under Levi Eshkol, and then Golda Meir and others, and continued by Rabin and Perez and others, for one reason, and one reason primarily, and that was security. And if you look at where the settlements are, ignore the little dots all over these territories. Many of these are extremely isolated. Sometimes they're just one or two outposts, and many of them can be removed in 24 hours if they have to be. But the yellow areas are the so-called settlement blocks, the main population centers, and they're all adjoining the green line. That's the ceasefire lines. And that was because after the Six-Day War, when Israel accepted Resolution 242, wanted to negotiate with her neighbors a final peace treaty, the Arab League en masse, that's all the Arab countries, issued the Khartoum Declaration. No peace, no negotiations, no recognition. So Israel said, okay, what are we going to do about the situation? We can't negotiate with anybody, but the UN itself recognizes that these ceasefire lines are indefensible. So we are going to create facts on the ground. Now, you can agree or disagree with that, but that was the reason the settlements were created. And actually, in this 73 war, which Israel nearly lost when Syria and Egypt attacked, the settlements were life-saving. The reason why they'd only just started, and most of them were military posts rather than civilian areas. They were largely army positions, and it meant that when the army had to be mobilized, and Israel is largely an army of, it's not an army of conscription, it's largely an army of reservists. In order to mobilize the army, the reservists have to be called up. And Israel would have been overrun if it wasn't for this fact that there were settlements had already been established in Sinai and in the Golan Heights. So these settlements have already proven their worth for security. And we also now know that the settlements have never really been an obstacle to peace. Under the various peace plans that have been proposed, the Palestinians have accepted that the settlements will stay. They only take up 5% or less of the land of the West Bank, and it's the West Bank that we're really considering here. They haven't been the obstacle to peace, and the Israelis have accepted the notion, which nobody asked them to, but they, for the sake of achieving a peace treaty, they agreed, okay, if we keep the settlement blocks, the main ones, we will undertake land swaps, and we will give the Palestinians parts of the Negev desert and elsewhere for their state. The Palestinians accepted that, incidentally. That wasn't a sticking point in any of the peace negotiations. And then Gaza, as we've mentioned, very peculiar situation. There isn't a single Israeli civilian or soldier in Gaza, and yet it's still called occupied Palestinian territory. And this has been described by this writer and others as occupied through remote control. And people say, oh wait, but Israel occupies the borders and the airspace. Well, Israel controls the borders and the airspace, and that makes it an occupying power of the whole of Gaza. That definition has never been applied in history to any other territory, except this one. And I rather like this quote from Avinoam Sharon, who says, "It would seem that the Israeli occupation that may never have begun cannot ever be brought to an end." And I think that's a very perceptive comment. So there are five, just before we finish this section, 5 key counter-arguments to the illegality claim. Israel exercised her right to self-defense under the UN Charter. The Gaza and West Bank were never sovereign territories, so they weren't formally, legally occupied by Israel. And the Jewish settlement is in accord with the Article 80 of the UN Charter, which explicitly states that Jewish settlement in what the former mandated territory should be encouraged. And that in any case, Jordan, who was the only conceivable sovereign power in the West Bank, relinquished all claims to sovereignty as part of its peace treaty with Israel. And the Oslo Accords, if all else fails, point to the Oslo Accords, because that changed the legal framework of all of these territories. There was actually no bar on settlement building under the Oslo Accords. What Israel undertook to do in Area C, which is where most of the settlements are, what she undertook to do, although she wasn't required to, she undertook not to create new settlements, and she hasn't done that. And she undertook not to expand the settlements beyond their existing boundaries, and she hasn't done that. So whenever you hear about Israel expanding the settlements, what that means is perhaps a school has been built, or some new housing has been built, or a sewer is being repaired, and that's called a settlement. And so this raises an interesting question, and it comes back to some of the other questions I've been raising. This isn't actually a legal argument at all. The people who use the term illegal occupation and settlements don't know what they're talking about. And it's being used politically. And it's been used to delegitimize Israel and to Israel's claims to these territories. I haven't mentioned East Jerusalem, but we have the ludicrous situation whereby Jews living in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem are called settlers. But Palestinians living in West Jerusalem, that's fine. The more the merrier. Nobody minds that. But if a Jew lives in the Jewish quarter, that's a settler. So there are some contradictions and inconsistencies here which doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, there's ignorance and or prejudice. So that's my third mini-talk over. There's just one last one after this, which is relatively short. So again, I'll take any burning questions or points of information, and then hopefully we'll open it up to wider discussion. Yes, the two ladies at the front here.
I can understand that the general public, from what they hear on the BBC and different things, are brainwashed into all what we hear that we're doing to the Palestinians, etc., etc. But what I can't understand is you're not ignorant. You have put together this talk, and it stands up, and you've said that you can defend it, etc. But these other people in the Lancet, are they just listening to other people with no questions, nothing? That they're totally against Israel without, because there can't just be you. There must be others.
The usual response I get is that I'm a liar.
Oh.
That's it. That's it. That's all they say. Because they don't... I've given a number of talks around, particularly on the Palestinian health theme, not so much on the legal theme, but certainly on the health theme. Nobody has been able to challenge me on any of the evidence I've presented. And so what they resort to doing is they call me by name. They say I'm a liar, I'm a paid propagandist, though I don't get paid a penny, I can assure you. On the contrary, I get paid nothing. I'm doing this because I believe it's right.
Where are they getting their information?
That's something, could we come back to that later on? Because I think it's a crucial question. Yes, please.
I'm a little unclear about something you said about the settlements.
Yeah.
In the 1973 war. You said that they saved Israel. Well, as far as I know, people who live in the settlements don't actually fight in the war. I thought that they didn't join the army. People in the settlements.
No. The vast majority of Israelis serve in the army. Those Israeli citizens who are exempt from the army are generally, first of all, the Israeli Arabs, okay, who by and large have not gone to settlements. And as you say, the ultra-Orthodox, the so-called Haredi Jews, who for religious reasons refuse to serve. Now, because of the image that we have of what a settler looks like, we think that those settlers are Haredi Jews. Now, some of them are, but the majority are not. And certainly in the 1973 war, the vast majority of them were secular Jews who were encouraged to go to these settlements because they were granted subsidies on mortgages, and there were new communities, and the conditions were very favorable, and there were new jobs created and that kind of thing. So they were all reserve soldiers. The youngsters were serving in the regular army, and the older ones were serving in the reserve army. And so when the attack happened unexpectedly on Yom Kippur, they were able to mobilize some of these units. Now, sadly, I don't want to give the impression that that was a famous victory and Israelis didn't suffer, because they lost huge numbers of casualties. A very large number of Israelis were killed, but the country wasn't overrun. And the point that I'm making was that had those settlements not existed, arguably, this is debatable, I agree with that, arguably that war would have been lost. But the point that I'm making is that it validated the political argument that Israel's left-wing governments had made in establishing the settlements, that they were necessary for security. That was the point that I was making. That's okay. Yes? Yes, indeed. Nobody called it an occupation then. One of the curiosities of all of this is we keep hearing about what a tragic situation the Palestinians are in, because nobody has thought that they deserve a state, and nobody has granted them a state. Actually, the only country that has granted the Palestinians the right to statehood alongside Israel is Israel. Israel is the only country and that has actually taken measures to try and establish that embryonic statehood. Because between 48 and 67, when Egypt occupied Gaza and Jordan occupied the West Bank, they weren't offered a state. As far as we know, there was no vociferous demand for one, but that bit of history is forgotten when there was an opportunity to create, over, after all, nearly 20 years, nearly a generation. Why didn't it happen? And again, this comes back to the question, what is the motivation behind this kind of criticism? I think that's a very valid point that you've made.